Oops. Wow. Hi, everybody. I'm Maria Davis, and welcome to Spark Change, where we hope to conform and inspire you to create positive change in your life and in your community. If you're watching this during the live stream, say hello in the chat. And if you have questions, please put those in the chat as well, and we'll answer those after the presentation. So, as you can see, we are here in beautiful downtown Angola. It is the Commercial Historic District. It is a municipally, it has an ordinance attached to it. So, that's one of those things that we have here in Angola. And I'm going to introduce you to Adam Toering. And Adam is currently a program coordinator with two preservation oriented nonprofit organizations, and those are Indiana Landmarks and South Bend TradeWorks. So, without further ado, here's Adam. Hello.
Hello. It's good to see you.
Um, Good seeing you. It's actually been a really long time,
Yeah.
several years. Um, So, is there anything that you would like to say to the audience before we get going? Because we're going to be talking about guidelines and
Yep.
historic districts, and we're going to get down to nitty gritty. But those things aren't just important to historic preservation; they are important to keeping up older properties, and their best practices guidelines are.
Absolutely. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this in more detail in my talk, but I joke regularly that I came to this honestly. Like I own, my wife and I own multiple old properties, and we sort of stumbled into that reality of like, what are we doing now? Like we bought these old properties. They need a lot of work. Where do we go for help? And the document that ultimately was created for the standards and guidelines, the model guidelines for preservation districts, as well as Indiana Landmarks, the organization I now work for. Like those are the sort of things that we actually looked to when we first bought our property. Like, what do we do? Like, how do we manage and wrestle with these projects that we're encountering? And again, I'll talk more about my background. I didn't go to school for preservation. Like I was a historian, so I knew how to research, but like finding information that is applicable and is appropriate and is helpful, especially in government. Sometimes that can be very hard to find in government. It was sort of part of our overall mission with what we were doing. Ultimately, when we worked on this project, but as homeowners, that's what we were looking for, is good information. And when you find good information, it should be shared. It should be distributed as widely as you can and cherished. So absolutely, resources, both at an individual level, like individual people, as you're accumulating information, you might learn it, but it's how you share it with the people around you that then can create amazing moments. Like a neighborhood can be transformed because information is shared freely between neighbors. But I have really strong opinions about this. I could talk about this for hours. And I'm just flattered that I was invited to talk today. So thank you.
Well, I am really grateful because I know you're very knowledgeable about a lot of things. I mean, you have worked in planning for literally hundreds of historic structures in South Bend and St. Joseph County. So, yeah, you have a lot of expertise to share with everyone. And I know guidelines can be a little bit dicey. Oh, they are really helpful. If you have an older home and you need to know something about it, to me, those would be the first documents I would go to because it would tell you about architecture, the aspects, and it would tell you all about okay materials. Bricks, old bricks. What do you do with old bricks? Do you paint them? Do you not paint them? Well, we know what the answer is to that, but I guess we'll get to that. We'll get to that later, and Todd as well tomorrow, so he can talk about those things. So I'll let you. I'll put this your presentation up, and I will disappear until you finish. All right?
Thank you, everyone. And again, glad to see some people popping up in the chat. I will do my best to respond to things as we're going. When I give presentations, I try and make them as conversational as possible, especially when I'm in person. I can talk about these subjects for long periods of time. So being respective of people's concerns and questions is something that I try and pride myself on. So if you do have questions, or if I'm saying something and it's not terribly familiar with you, I will not be offended if you ask for more clarification. So please ask. So once again, I'm going to be talking about preservation standards. And I have this brief objective slide. Sometimes my objective slides can be like way too big because it's all of the different things I'm trying to cover in some of the workshops that I teach. But today's objectives, we're going to give you an introduction. I'm going to talk about placemaking, which is a buzzword that we hear a lot in planning circles, in preservation circles, and community development. And I jokingly put in historic and then bullet point preservation, designation, standards and guidelines. And we're going to wrap up with some question and answer at the end. I will readily admit I have never been to Angola, and I was actually really bummed that ultimately this was remote. In this case, it worked well for me because I had some other obligations today too. So I promise that I will get to Angola at some point. But the first thing that I do, and you're going to learn this about my background is history. I research before I get into something. So I had fun researching Angola and Angola history, and you're going to see some slides with some imagery of structures in Angola in this presentation. So here's your courthouse, which is beautiful, which is hilarious. The credit, though, is for the Lawrence County Museum of History. So for whatever reason, there was a picture of the Steuben County courthouse in the Lawrence County Museum of History. So brief introduction about myself. I'm Adam Toering. I'm a program coordinator with Indiana Landmarks and South Bend TradeWorks. We're going to talk a little bit more about them in a moment here. I am a historian by trade. I was a non-traditional student. I didn't get my college degree until I was in my 30s. I had a number of random and odd jobs before that. And I studied history at Purdue with a focus in history of technology. I am an old house owner. Like my wife and I own 3 old houses in South Bend, very close to the downtown. We were able to purchase all 3 of those at the same time for a very little amount of money, which meant that those houses needed a lot of work. And I have spent the last 8 years doing projects on those houses. There's some that are visible in these pictures here. That is primarily the house that we live in, and been slowly restoring the windows and restoring the siding, and generally tuning up this old house that was built in 1912. I will tell you that I came to preservation honestly, insofar as I didn't go to school for it. It was just that my wife and I bought an old house that needed a lot of work, and we needed to figure it out. At the time, I was working at the History Museum here in South Bend, Indiana, and I wasn't making a lot of money. So when we were encountering projects, we couldn't afford to pay somebody to do a lot of the projects that we needed to do. So it literally resulted in me doing the project. We once had a window replacement contractor. This is like sacrilege in historic preservation circles, but we had a window replacement contractor come out and quote us out the price to replace our windows. And I about threw him out of the house when he quoted me like half the value of our house for replacing the windows. And I looked at my wife afterwards and said, I think we can restore these windows. Like, I think that's something that I can learn to do. And I have. You'll see in this photo and one more photo in this slideshow is Sadie, my golden doodle, or our golden doodle. She is the project supervisor, and she also is a bay window appreciator. That is her perch where she watches everything that goes on in our neighborhood. But she is always attentive of when I am outside and on a ladder. She is very aware of where I am. As was stated earlier, I'm currently working for Indiana Landmarks and South Bend TradeWorks, 2 preservation nonprofits here in the state of Indiana. South Bend is localized here South Bend TradeWorks is localized here in South Bend, Indiana. But South Bend TradeWorks is devoted to deconstruction of buildings and materials that are probably going to end up in the landfill. So we work to go in and salvage materials when that's happening. We have a salvage shop that is open a couple days a week right now, which we're in the process of winding up and growing. And then we also promote and provide trades training programs, both for homeowners and for contractors having to do with traditional trades. And that is in conjunction with Indiana Landmarks. One of Indiana Landmarks' strategic goals for the immediate future is to promote and create a traditional trades pipeline here in the state of Indiana to ensure that we have skilled tradespeople to do the projects that we need done. So I get to wear two hats with those two organizations, working in a really symbiotic way, promoting traditional trades and promoting deconstruction and salvage. It's a lot of fun. Prior to working for Indiana Landmarks and South Bend TradeWorks, I was with the city of South Bend. I was the historic preservation administrator up until December. I'd been in the historic preservation office since the fall of 2017 when I was hired in. And prior to that, I worked at the History Museum, as I said, both in their collections department and then in their marketing department. I honestly say that I stumbled into historic preservation. I did not go to school for it, as I said earlier, but I learned to love it, and it is the world that I am living in now. And I think that you will find value in the benefits that it provides to our communities. So I want to talk first and foremost about placemaking. I remember distinctly when my now wife brought me to South Bend for the first time back in 2014 or 2013, it was 2013 maybe, to visit her parents. And like, you have these little snippets of memory of a space the first time that you're encountering it. And I find that really fascinating, because you're constructing this place in your memory and in your mind. And we do that with maps, and we also do that with the space as we're living in it. We're making it better actively. Placemaking is an active vocation. It is an active thing. And there are a number of ways that we do that. I love maps. As a historian, I jokingly say I live in maps. So as I was preparing for this talk, I ended up doing what I do, which is research and looking at the Indiana State Library's online database of records and documents, and found this amazing record. It's Indiana Highway Survey Commission map of Steuben County from 1936. And it shows in a number of different ways icons and landmarks and points of interest that we then construct our understanding and view of that space based upon. I find that absolutely fascinating. And when we take vacations, we go somewhere and we're like, oh, there was this amazing cafe, it was on this cool street, and we experience that place and we're in awe of it. And we might think for a moment that that space was just magic wanded into existence and it's perfect and immaculate and amazing. And well, we can never have that here. But then you need to remember and realize that that space was crafted and created and cultivated into what you're seeing and experiencing. And we can do that here too. That takes a lot of work. And I say that, like, I won't say ominously, but like, it takes a lot of intentionality and a lot of deliberate action and a lot of communication and cooperation and investment of either time, money, or talent to create a space that people want to be in. But we would all agree that special, unique spaces make our life better. And that placemaking experience is a constructive and beneficial process. Historic preservation, as a matter of principle, is about placemaking. Like, we're quantifying and saying that the old buildings and structures and the social history and cultural history that is associated with those spaces enriches our life. It makes our life better. we find and quantify those structures, whether we realize it or not, whether it has been formally designated or not. There are things that are landmarks, like, and you've probably done this where you've given somebody a description of a route that they need to take, and along that route there was a thing. Oh, there's going to be the big elm tree on the side of the road. It's a landmark. It is a feature or a fixture that we can all look to and find importance in. It is an item or an icon on that map that we then point to. That process is a communal process. Like, we're doing that collectively, saying this is an important thing to us. Here again is a picture from the State Historical Society, and it is again your courthouse and jail in your downtown area in Angola. Beautiful structures, and iconic and historic. And we can agree that they are, from a matter of law, they have become historically designated. We have a boundary around this area through the passage of an ordinance to create a local historic district. That designation is enshrined in law in the state of Indiana. There is a legal background and foundation to protect this conversation about collective good in this structure and the preservation of this structure. But I stress as a matter of law, because that boundary and the delineation point of what is protected, and then by the outside of that is not protected. It does not have the restriction that the area within the red boundary has. Is a reminder that the law only goes so far. And I can tell you from an anecdotal point, I had a phone call from a property owner in the city of South Bend who was upset that a building was going to be built across the street from their property that was in a historic district, but the empty lot was not in the historic district. And I was like, there's not much we can do. We can work with the property owner and try and encourage them to do a better project, but they are they are outside of the legal restriction on this designated area. So we should not attempt to impose in a draconian way, in a restrictive way, this is the way it should be. We can only hope to suggest and encourage them to do the right thing. And I will tell you, that's what happened with that construction project. The neighborhood talked to the property owner who was building a laundromat, and they ended up building a more attractive brick building that was facing the street and engaged with the street and was well lit. And the neighborhood has received that and recognizes how many people use the laundromat. Like, it is a benefit to their community. Even though it is outside of the local historic district, it still is complementary to, without being required to do so. So understanding the legal limits and legal restrictions that come with that limit of the boundary creation through the passage of an ordinance creating a historic district. But it is law that is required that these things should happen. Now, the question of what is required is where we get to when we talk about historic standards and guidelines. So when I started in the fall of 2017, the office that I worked in was a decent sized office. It was myself and one other person. We were currently at that time part of the St. Joseph County department, and our office, there was probably 30 feet of file cabinets with records in file cabinet after file cabinet after file cabinet. And soon after I was hired, I was notified, and my boss was notified, that our department was being eliminated and we were being transferred to the city of South Bend, which all told was a good transition. We ended up being more funded and more supported once we were within the city of South Bend's administration. But there was one requirement that they asked of us. They're like, Adam, you have to digitize all of your records. So this 30 feet of filing cabinets and all of these other records, we had to then engage in a multi-year process to digitize all of our records. And at that time, we had file folders for every single property, some 8,000 plus properties in St. Joseph County. And of those 8,000, a few thousand were protected properties within our local historic districts. We had 9 local historic districts and a few hundred individual local landmarks as standalone sites. When I mentioned earlier, Angola has a designated historic district in its urban core, its downtown core. South Bend was beat up by the urban renewal process and tore down a great deal of our commercial buildings in the downtown area. So South Bend has no downtown commercial district. That's how sparse and I use the term toothless, like so many missing teeth in our downtown urban environment, that we have individual standalone local landmarks in our downtown area. And so if you scrutinize and look closely at this map that is on the screen, you will see dark gray marks on the map, and those are our individual local landmarks. And there were literally hundreds of those spread out throughout the community and throughout the county. But there were 9 local historic districts. I mention all of these because these 9 local historic districts and these individual local landmarks, and then there was another kind of landmark area, which was our cultural heritage park district. All 11 of those different groups had different standards and guidelines, which was incredibly frustrating for staff because there was a lot of complexity and nuance between all the different standards. And it was incredibly confusing for the public because one neighborhood on one side of a street might have one rule, and then across the street, there was a slightly different rule. So by about 2018, 2019, we were having active conversations, both internally in our office, as well as with our partners, who oftentimes is Indiana Landmarks, about the need for a massive project to redo our standards and guidelines. And we were understanding of how extreme of a request and project this was going to be. And that's why we pulled in the partners with Indiana Landmarks to have these conversations. And ultimately what we worked towards creating were model guidelines, which have now been adopted by a number of communities throughout the state, including Angola. This took multiple years of engagement and brainstorming and public meetings and internal correspondence. There was consultants. It was a big process to create a product that did a number of things. One thing that we were really concerned about was that all of these different documents, they were not very, if I'm being blunt, easy to read. Again, I'm a historian. I'm used to dealing with lots of data, but if I'm having to read through something 7 or 8 times to understand what is not covered by this section of text, I would jokingly say, if I'm confused, the public is, pardon my language, screwed. They're in deep trouble if they have any hope of trying to understand what we're trying to provide to them. So legibility and just ease of consumption was critically important to us. So it was a policy direction that we wanted to make an easily consumed product. We also wanted to make it formatted in a way that reflected, I'm going to jump back a slide, pardon me. As I mentioned earlier, we had 9 historic districts. Those were primarily residential districts, overwhelmingly filled with single family residential housing. In a single house per lot scale, very little commercial buildings. And so our standards and guidelines didn't reflect the commercial projects when they would come across the desk of the Historic Preservation Commission. There was one small section about signage, which for those of you who are involved with changing historic buildings, signage is a big part about changing historic buildings. Making sure that the sign is appropriate in scale and size, in format. All of those things were totally not mentioned in our previous standards and guidelines. So we wanted to create a document that more reflected the kinds of properties that we were seeing, both residential and commercial. And then we also wanted to make it so it was less prescriptive, telling you what you had to do, and more talking to you about what you were going to be doing. So you're working on a roof project, for example. Here's common concerns that you might have with a roof project. That was the direction that we wanted the document to move in. We then had public engagement meetings after the drafts were created, because it was, again, this was going to be presented to the public, and all of those 9 different local historic districts, thousands of property owners had to accept that this was in their best interest, that it was a positive change for them. And overwhelmingly, almost exhaustively, overwhelmingly positive feedback. There were some concerns, but then when we engaged with them and talked with them, which is going to be a common theme in many of my talks, you've got to have conversations that are going to be difficult about common interests. They quickly realized that, no, this is good. This is going to make it easier. This is also going to talk about alternative materials. It's going to be talking about solar collection and solar panels in a way that wasn't out of the 1980s, where the solar field would be in the yard. But let's talk about roof-mounted solar panels. As I said, alternative materials. All of these things needed to be in the document because this is the world that we're living in today. Preservation has evolved since, I will tell you, our first standards and guidelines, which were adopted in the 1970s. Things have changed significantly since then in how we perceive placemaking, and how we perceive our historic districts, and how we perceive the positive way of making changes incrementally in our neighborhoods. So as I said, we had a number of positive neighborhood engagement meetings. There were flyers, there was mailers, there was a website, there was an engagement portal. We went all out on it because we wanted to ensure that the buy-in was sincere and real. And we were successful in that. As an example, as I said earlier, the previous standards didn't really have text about signage with our commercial properties. And so the new standards and guidelines show diagrams of structures, of like the common form of the building, an idealized recommendation about what to do. And then it divided it into 2 categories, because when projects are received by historic preservation commissions across the state, 2 things typically happen. Either it is administratively reviewed and approved by staff, if the commission has a paid staff member, or it goes to the commission, who meets maybe once a month, to be reviewed by that body. In South Bend, we were talking about thousands of properties. We needed to be fast. We needed to be expediting the review process for many projects, because otherwise our meetings would be hours long. So we encouraged and pushed for administrative approval categories for a number of projects, which again shows the property owner, like, it's a range of projects in a range of investments, in a range of skill levels. If you do this, it's approvable right now, immediately. You can ask to do this, but it will take you longer, and your probability of approval may or may not be lower. So choose wisely as you're navigating this process, trying to show people the positive outcome and the positive solution in a constructive way. I will tell you that it accelerated so many projects. There were a number of projects that previously we would, because of gaps in the standards and guidelines, it would be required to be reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission in South Bend. And the new standards eliminated those sort of concerns, where certain projects were accelerated through the review process because it made sense. Which gets us to another comment about policy, expediency. All of you, I'm sure, have some sort of perception of government, and I'm saying this as someone who worked in government and has worked in nonprofits. Like, we create paper, we create work, and the perception is not always positive that we're helping the circumstance. I think there's a Reagan quote about this. I'm from the government and I'm here to help, like, sort of ominous words. but we really strove and prided ourselves. We wanted to be perceived as a benefit, as a resource. That this is not a hindrance restriction document. This is a benefit. This is to help you amplify your building, help you amplify your home, and care for it. Based upon our best practices, based upon the federal government's best practices, based upon these concerns, you can result in a longer, better, safer place for you and your family to live and work. I could cover a whole bunch of bases here and go off on all sorts of tangents, but the whole idea is to create investment. Like we want people to be investing in their houses. My wife and I bought 3 houses that had suffered from years, dare I say, decades of lack of maintenance, deferred maintenance, lack of investment. And when we started doing projects, our neighbors were thrilled that we were doing what we were doing. Because people get excited when they see investment. And investment can come in one of those 3 ways that I mentioned earlier. It can come in the form of money by paying somebody to do it. It can come in the form of time, like you spending the sweat equity to do the work yourself, or it can come in talent, like you have benefited from spending lots of time and have sculpted your skill set into being able to accomplish amazing things yourself. Those 3 different kinds of investment, you want to see that in your downtown. You want to see that in your neighborhoods. And it doesn't necessarily need to be someone coming in from outside and throwing a bunch of money at the problem. It could be the local business owner slowly, incrementally picking away at the projects that they've got. The screen shows currently a storefront in Franklin, Indiana. I had the benefit of being in Franklin just this past week, if I'm not mistaken. And Franklin is a fascinating little community south of Indianapolis. They have done an amazing job of creating a culture of investment in their historic fabric, and it is paying dividends. Here we're looking at a section, I think this is, I can't remember if this is Main Street or one of the other streets. It is right by their downtown. I think the courthouse square is sort of behind the view here. And this was in 2013. So this is a view of that building in 2013. And this struck me because when I was there last week, this is not what I saw. Come on, slide. There we go. This is what I saw. This is miraculous investment. But this, again, as I return to what I started this conversation about, where you go somewhere and you're like, oh, this is amazing. And it was magic wanded into this, this beautiful state. And it's been this way always. I was startled. I looked this up recently because I had this photo on my phone and I could not believe what the building looked like before to be transformed into this. This is the kind of investment that we want to see universally in our communities, where you take a structure straight out of the 1950s, 1960s, nothing against the 1950s or 1960s, but sort of muted, quieted storefront, devoid of any sort of glazing. Like all the windows in the second story are gone. There are a number of structures in South Bend that have had this unfortunate change to them. And we are advocating and encouraging positive investment because this immediately created a more inviting and enjoyable downtown urban space. They have worked hard. And again, returning to that magic wand comment, I benefited from knowing some of the people that are active in the preservation community there in Franklin. They have been working tirelessly at this for decades and encouraging investment and encouraging promotion of historic preservation as a value and as a value add to their community, to the point that it is now part of their community's fabric and it is gaining momentum. They have amazing facade grant programs that couple with the historic preservation's sort of values to encourage investment and development of their downtown area. I've covered a number of topics here and jumped around a little bit. I promised I would try and keep this to about 30 minutes. But I offer it up for questions. I obligatory, contractually obligated to show my dog again. But I would gladly answer questions about standards and guidelines adoption, standards and guidelines and what it does and how it is valuable, and the benefits that we saw with property owners with regards to projects, all sorts of topics that could be mined into, and would gladly talk about them. So if there are questions, I am available.
Okay, I do have a question for you.
Please.
So, modern materials versus turn of the century materials. Okay,
Yeah.
often there's this idea that modern equates to better quality. The whole saying about, well, if they had that back then, they would have used it. That could be the case. I don't doubt that is something. But can we talk about that? And let's talk about windows, because that seems to be about a bone of contention in historic districts.
So I can speak, and I'm going to graduate this at different levels. And I say that, like, from a residential level, like I mentioned the anecdote about me and restoring our windows. When I was quoted, I don't shy away from this. My wife and I purchased 3 houses for $93,000. So, like, you can put it in perspective what sort of condition those houses were in and what sort of care they needed. And the window replacement contractor came out and quoted us for, I think, 26 windows on our house, $55,000. And, like, the economics of that in any circumstance are just insane. For there to be that kind of financial investment needed to affect some supposed change in energy efficiency, like, there have been studies that have been done about this. You will not recoup the financial savings for your energy efficiency upgrades from that investment on a replacement window if you're spending $55,000. It just won't happen in your lifetime. So that's the first kernel I'll say about replacement windows from a residential perspective, that in many cases, the financial benefit, I don't believe, weighs out, because the amount of investment required to get the supposed energy efficiency upgrade isn't there. And that's assuming a relatively high quality product that would last. And that's the next part of the equation is, when I was in the role of administrator at South Bend, we were reviewing replacement window projects for windows that had been installed 10 years ago. So, like, a replacement window was installed in 2012, and that window was already failing. And that is very alarming to me, because part of what I see, what we're advocating for, is for long-term investment in a structure. You want the structure and the components that are in that structure to last as long as possible for the investment put in. And I'll give another anecdote. There's houses that are directly across the street from my house that were built in, I believe, 2008 or 2009. I can't remember. It was like right around the housing crisis, ironically. But the homeowner directly across the street just replaced the windows on this brand new house that was built. When I say brand new, this less than 20-year-old house. That's very alarming to me from a life cycle perspective of materials. So, understanding that you're balancing this sort of equation about your investment, whatever that is, and what is your return in lifespan, in durability, in energy efficiency. It is not just a, like, flat 1-for-1 discussion. There's a number of variables in that equation. That being said, I think there are some high quality windows that are available. It's how long is it going to last? That's where I keep on coming back to. And in some applications, replacement, I have gone and done site visits to do assessments and said, you should replace these windows. Like, I advocate for restoration. I teach restoration classes. And there have been conversations where I've said replacement is appropriate, but then it becomes what product are you picking and how long is it going to last? Overall, there's internet memes about it, but like where they show wood quality from today versus wood quality of 110 years ago. We're fast growing wood at this point for expediency's sake and for financial reasons. And that wood is just not as hardy as the wood that many of these houses were built with 110 years ago. So I am a strong advocate for retention of original materials just because you won't get it back. And that's part of the reason why I'm involved with South Bend TradeWorks. Even when we are going to encounter this scenario where this material is going to be lost, we need to go in and get it because it's better than what you're buying new in many cases. And so as a great example, no protections on this structure, just catty corner from me. There was a little cottage that had 7-foot windows, which for the audience, 7 feet are ridiculously huge. like those are really tall windows, and they were doing a total house gut, and I was able to get the jambs and they are in my yard right now because we don't have space for them at TradeWorks shop, but they are massive, amazing jambs that we literally couldn't afford to have made now. And to them, it was like, no, we need to get rid of them. And so I thankfully approached the property owner and said, hey, what are you doing with those? He's like, do you want them? I'm like, yes, I would gladly take those. So there's middle of the day, there's me with a dolly rolling like these 7-foot window jambs across the street. And I say that like there will be somebody who will use that window and find value in it. And I would hazard to say that it will outlast, after restoration, after reglazing, after all of these, projects, it will outlast the window that was just installed in that house. Which I have strong philosophical reasons why I believe in that. Partly as a historian, like I want these things to last. I see the question. I apologize. Jeanette G asks, what are resources that might connect people who have a historical property with those able to do work in a historically appropriate way? Excellent question. So I talked a little bit about Franklin, Indiana, and sort of this culture of preservation that they're cultivating there. And one of the things that we worked on strongly here in South Bend is that if all I was doing was keeping the rules, I was failing. I needed to promote the culture of preservation and the community of preservation. And there's a couple things that our community here has that I'm very proud or protective of. And one of those is a group we call Beer and Buildings. They get together at a different person's house every month. And it's just a social group to talk about the projects that people are working on, primarily residential in focus, but we do go to commercial buildings. Now, I will tell you, when I was in my prior role, the real reason that I was super happy that that group existed is people would call me and say, Adam, who should I hire? And as a government employee, I could not say anything to endorse or to, in other cases, like tell them, like, you need to run away from this contractor. Like now I feel a little more free that I can speak a little bit better about that. But at the time, it would be, I won't say traumatizing, but I'd be working with somebody and I was like, just sort of watching a car accident, like knowing that this contractor was taking advantage of them. And so encouraging like your community, like talk to your neighbors. It sounds silly or trite, but like share information with your neighbors is the first place I would start. Other commercial property owners, if you're talking about commercial properties, and just sort of exchange and see like, oh, there's a great project there. Who did they use? And what was their experience? Because that's the other thing. It might look great, but then you find out that they had a horrible experience with the contractor themselves. It wasn't like a very satisfying experience, or they had to be very attentive. And I will tell you that both my wife and I are in sort of the construction world. And we have not always had positive experiences with hiring contractors, and we live in this. So it is a very tough market, and we need more contractors. But the first place I would tell you is your neighbors and friends and people, because they're going to speak much more freely and much more honestly than anyone else. After that, like leaning on organizations like Indiana Landmarks, your local community development organizations, like your local business organizations, your I'm not gonna say Better Business, but like a Chamber of Commerce, like see who's being endorsed and who's being supported, because that matters. Like it is your community, and a contractor, in my opinion, that's worth their salt will care about how they're perceived in their community. And if they're not going to last long, and they're going to get drummed out. Hopefully that helps a little bit. I mean, from a technical perspective, there are, like I said, the standards and guidelines that we were talking about earlier. Then there's some very technical documents from the National Park Service called the preservation briefs that get a little more in depth on certain specific subjects that can inform you as a property owner about what kind of work is being done, because you have to be informed yourself to know that they're doing something right or something wrong. And you either need to build trust with a contractor who will learn with you, or be informed enough to be dangerous to where they know that you are paying attention to what they're doing. I have unfortunate horror stories about, I had a property owner who reached out to me. He's like, Adam, there's an issue. We're having a leak, and there's something like, you need to come out and look at this. We need to replace this window. And I showed up, and they were so proud of this work that had been done. And then in conversations, it was revealed that the work that was done by this contractor that they were so proud of is what created the leak. Like it was the work, and they didn't know to know better to scrutinize that project. And I believe I won't say went after that contractor, but they did make it right. So also lean on your local municipal HPC and like government entities. Like they can assist you as they can. Like it is a small office. It was myself and one other person running as fast as we could, trying to keep up with all the emails and phone calls. So I would say trust that they are busy, but they want to see you succeed.
So I have a final question.
Please.
So Indiana Landmarks is a stakeholder for the state of Indiana in historic preservation, correct? In the ordinance or the code, the Indiana code. So anyone in any city, whether they have a district or not, can contact Indiana Landmarks for help should they need help for the preservation of a building, or they just want assistance, maybe resources, connection. Am I correct about all that? And if you can like expand on that a little bit, that'd be great.
Absolutely. We are. I will tell you, one of my first introductions to preservation once we moved and purchased these houses was going to a Indiana Landmarks hands-on plaster repair class. Like my wife and I bought multiple houses that needed a lot of work, and we were looking at plaster. We didn't know anything about plaster. So my first interaction with Indiana Landmarks was coming to a class. I was an attendee, a student. And we are so blessed. And when I say we, the state of Indiana is so blessed to have an organization like Indiana Landmarks here, and as robust as it is, as strong as it is, with offices across the state, 50 some odd employees, dedicated and focused on advocating for preservation matters, helping property owners with preservation issues. They provide staff to communities that need preservation services. Like it is a incredible organization. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to check out Indiana Landmarks website, indianalandmarks.org. We are member driven. We have, I think, 3,600 members. And we support ourselves through donations and financial support from members. An incredible organization that the state of Indiana is incredibly fortunate to have. I think I always sort of butcher this statistic. We are the largest statewide preservation organization in the country. Like, it is that strong and robust, and we're very, very fortunate to have it. And for them to be in your corner, whether it's a commercial building or a residential property, they are cheering you on and supporting you. And that is their mission. So very, very happy to be working with them, and flattered that they wanted to be working with them. So it's been a lot of fun.
Great. And with that, I truly appreciate that you agreed to talk, because you are an expert in all these things. So thank you. If you could hang out backstage for just a little bit, I'm going to wrap up the stream, and then you get to go back to whatever you were doing.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, everybody, you know the drill. If you thought the information in this video was useful and you enjoyed the content, please like and subscribe to the Folio Nova YouTube channel, and also sign up on the Spark Change website for updates, and let us know if there's any other content that you'd like information on. We hope to do a few more of these in the future. So thank you. And let's all work together to make the world a better place. Thanks for watching.